Good afternoon. We are going to start our second session and it's going to be in English. So if you would like to hear the translation, or maybe you're too tired to think in English, I invite you to go outside and you will have the translation devices if you wish. This is our second and last debate of today. We've got 135 activities in this biennial. It's a very intense week until next week. That, by the way, it's February the 11th, the Day of Women and Children in Science. Today, we are reflecting about micro and micro. We've been talking before about microbiology of the bodies and the cities, and today we're going to talk about another link, which is what we call life architecture. This discussion is entitled we will have Rachel Armstrong. She's a professor of experimental architecture and he's been promoting life architecture. We have Michael Winston. He's the director of the technologies programs in Graduate School of Architectural Association. And we will have as a moderator Alkeri Arcopelu. She's founder of Dynamic Studio. Areti?
Gracias.
Thank you.
Buenas tardes, good evening everybody. I'm actually very happy today to moderate this session. It's called City as a Living Organism, and it is one of the few activities within the City and Science that is dealing with architecture, that is dealing with how we build and how science can affect the way that we design and build our buildings, our public spaces, and our cities today. We will actually be debating a series of different things with the contribution of our speakers, but also with the discussion that will follow after their presentations. You will all be welcome to participate in that discussion with your questions and reflections, so please feel free to do that. Our goal today is to combine city and science, to combine architecture with synthetic biology, to combine design with material engineering, to combine finally the urban with complex systems theory, but also with technologies related with artificial intelligence or computational design. So if we have a look at the data that they are related with our public space and with our built space, with our buildings, we will realize that actually our built space is one of the major contaminating agent, and our buildings are responsible for almost 40% of the energy that we consume, but also more than 35% of the CO2 emissions in the air. So our architecture is a consuming agent. It's an agent that consumes resources and eventually gives very little back in terms of that not very equal symbiosis, I would say. So our discussion today is about understanding whereas design combined with science can actually give us solutions for architecture, that we do not treat that architecture anymore as an artifact, as something that is being there consuming, but rather as a living organism. And as a living organism, we understand that then city or buildings and architecture, they acquire biological functions. That means that our cities and buildings, they start to breathe, they start to filter, they start to actually adapt, they start to self-repair. No? And all those qualities that we can see into our living world, in our human bodies or in our animal, let's say, and bacterial living world, those are the principles that we wish to explore how we can bring to architecture, in order to transform our built spaces into spaces that they are not only self-sufficient, that they are not only catering, but they can also generate resources, and they can finally create a more balanced ecological wisdom and symbiosis with other species, but also with the environment itself. So within, let's say, this big and challenging topic, we have, as Laura introduced in the beginning, we have Rachel Armstrong and Michael Weinstock contributing with a short presentation. Before passing the word to them, allow me to quickly introduce them. Rachel Armstrong, she's a biochemist. She knows about biology, about chemistry, but she has turned into an expert in architecture. She calls that experimental architecture. She is a professor of experimental architecture at the University of Newcastle, and she had defined through her work and her research an alternative approach to sustainability related to the properties of the natural world and the production of what she calls built environments of living architecture in the 21st century. Rachel is a highly influential person. She has been named as one of the 10 people that would transform the future of the UK, but she has also nominated as one of the 9 most inspiring women by the Chick Chip magazine. Her work is combining ways of designing and building with biochemistry, but also with biology, and we will see that in a variety of different projects that she will share with us. Now, next to her, Michael Weinstock. He's an architect, and he's a member of the Royal Society of Arts. He's the founder and director of the Emergent Technologies and Design program at the Architectural Association in London, one of the leading schools in experimenting architecture and computation. And in the last decade, his work has emerged from research into dynamics, forms and transactions of energy in natural systems. And of course, the application of computation or mathematics and processes of emergence in cities, in single buildings, but also in the combination and the groups of them. So Rachel and Michael are both researchers, architects, but also educators. They will share with us today part of their work, so thank you for being here with us, you two, but also you all down there. And Rachel, please join us for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that great introduction, Areti. It's great to be here, and I'm going to leap straight into the why. Why do we care about something like metabolism in architecture, in cities? Why do we care at all? And part of it is because we are faced with a particular predicament where we're seeing widespread collapse across all levels of order of the living world, from societies to ecologies to politics to economics. And Umair Haq here, he points out that this widespread collapse is because that we are undervaluing and over-exploiting the very fabric on which we depend. And we don't notice that our systems are struggling until the upper layers that are supported by the foundations of society and ecology are no longer there to hold them up. So what do we do about a condition of exploitation, and as Areti said at the beginning, extracting things without or with giving very little back? And metabolism starts to become one of those approaches that we may think through and literally with as to how we might start to tackle something that seems so incredibly unfathomably complex and impossible to resolve. Now, I'm not going to propose to resolve this, but what I will do is try to draw attention to the way we think about life and design. And since the Enlightenment, we've really thought about this top-down model of control and order of the world. And architecture, the way we think about it, is really modelled in the way that we think about life through the central dogma. And this idea that DNA, call it the architect, controls the RNA, call that the architectural blueprint, the systems that will be implemented by builders, and the proteins that are the builders and the people that actually make a place in which we live. And Victor de Lorenzo starts to interrogate this idea of the top-down control and order of things through this idea of metabolism. Now, he's a researcher at CSIC in Madrid, and he's been working with engineered microbes for over 10 years or so. And what he's noticed in the laboratory is that when we only think about the genes or the architect as the only system of control, we neglect other important factors. In this case, he's identified chemistry and metabolism as some of those factors. But in architectural terms, we might think of that as the activities of daily living, the small contributions that many people make to the way that a city runs. And what he does, I think, which is interesting for this discussion, is to create a cultural link between the idea of metabolism and genetics. He describes metabolism as the economy of living things, and genetics as its politics. And he says that whether we like it or not, it's ultimately metabolism that enables political or genetic decisions to exist at all. So when we neglect the idea of metabolism, as I say, I'm going to propose this both as a metaphor and as an actual technology, which, like the metaphor of machine, an actual technology of machine, start to help us create a condition in which the way that we think about something helps us work through those sets of principles in actual practice. So, as a design concept, I'm going to be talking about the idea of metabolism as an ecology of material and resource exchange. It's going to keep it very, very simple like that. So going from what bacteria do through to how we might design with bacteria. Now, why do we need to make this transition? Well, because the underpinning framework for thinking about buildings right now is the machine. And it's really brought to the fore in the International Space Station, where we can actually see all those engineering principles that bring about every aspect of our daily lives. So it's like a concentrated version of Le Corbusier's machine for living. That would all be very well if it didn't have unwanted side effects. And so we're seeing that with globalization and the rate and the speed of consumption and development of humanity across the planet, that we're starting to witness toxic side effects that are interfering with our daily lives, not only affecting the atmosphere, but also in those invisible spaces which we don't really care to investigate. We're not seeing the nutrients that we would normally consume being returned as functional soils. They're starting to clog up our infrastructures as fatbergs, and the flow of life and resource through a city is very much choked by the way that we are framing the way that our buildings work and function. So how does nature do this? Well, nature works through this idea of soil and composting. Well, it's more than an idea, it's an actual incredibly complex system. They're giant hyperbodies that are made up of many active agents, creatures, and elemental infrastructures that enable a constant flow and recycling of unwanted resource, let's say. So whilst modernity deals in waste, things that we can dispose of, nature doesn't deal with waste, it deals with resource. And so the soil becomes a transformer of possibility, being able to reconfigure the molecular structure of things and transform it into other forms of resource which may become available to biological systems. Now, the first group of designers that started to literally knit together metabolism with the idea of building design was Philips, and the Philips Lighting Company in the Netherlands. And they proposed a microbial home in 2011. And at the time, it was a speculative idea. It was an idea that the waste in our kitchen could be composted through specific apparatuses, which would then extract certain resources, in this case biogas, to create lighting and heat for further activity in the kitchen. And so it would be not quite a closed-loop system, but starting to move towards recycling waste in the kitchen to be used again in our preparation of food, which effectively is the heart of a house, home, and city. But how do we actually design with metabolism itself, when this is a metabolism of a human cell? It is unfathomably complex. I mean, how do people actually start to unpick something like this when this is actually much simpler than what happens in the metabolizing soils that do this natural recycling? Well, I think it's at a point where we start to realize that we have to start to design and engineer in different ways. This is not all just about human control, and that we actually have to call upon the experts of metabolism that have been hanging around for 3.5 billion years, the bacteria. Now, bacteria are all about metabolism, pretty much. They've sacrificed their superpowers in metabolism for structure. And so whilst bacteria pretend to be multicellular organisms, they still have that potential to be individual agents as well. But bacteria, when they start to metabolize their environment, reusing, recycling, making new opportunities for resource utilization, they are not entirely selfish all the time. They do actually start to work together as communities, which we can think of as microbial cities. So these are biofilms. These are soft structures. These aren't hard architectures like humans produce. These are soft carbohydrate structures that are infiltrated and contain the bodies of maybe different species of bacteria. And they use these as ways of forming metabolic landscapes that start to exploit, but also return resources to the sites that they occupy. Now, this doesn't just happen at a tiny scale. Biofilms are actually quite scalable. So here in the city of Venice, we can start seeing complex forms of microbial structures cohabiting along the side of a canal. And here we can see thrombolites, which are accretions of minerals within the soft bodies of algae and bacterial mats. So they've infiltrated it and started to form hard architectures like the ones we recognize, but obviously at a much smaller scale. And in this way, we can see how microbes and people start to cohabit in terms of their structural development and also in the mutual use of resources, except we also produce lots and lots of toxic ones. Now, microbes can go beyond the extent of a city. They actually work at architectural and even super architectural scales. And this is an algae biofilm which is expanding and becoming the size of a small island there. So microbial action is very scalable. How we control it may not be so, but in terms of the volumes they can occupy, we need to remember that 3.5 billion years ago, that the world was thick with microbial mats, thick enough to actually change the nature of the atmosphere on this planet from being a reducing environment full of noxious greenhouse gases to an oxygen-rich environment. So microbes already have that ability to be able to change the atmosphere, not just the atmosphere, but also the minerals and produce the soils of the world. So how do we actually start to tap into that world-building potential of microbes? Well, this is a schema for the Living Architecture project, which I'm coordinator of, which is an EU-funded Horizon 2020 project with another 5 European partners, including CSIC in Madrid, Explora Biotech in Italy, Trento University in Italy, Liquifer Systems Group in Vienna, and the University of the West of England in Bristol. And together we're trying to figure out, how do we actually design and engineer with metabolism? So before I show you any structures, I'm just going to talk about the principles through which we're trying to do this. So think of a cow's stomach. In one end, we put resource. In this specific case, it's urine and wastewater. That then enters into a series of chambers in which different microbial environments work, and that the products are sent from one chamber to the next to provide a series of resources that include polished water, electricity, and forms of organic products. In our case, inorganic phosphate is the biological marker that shows us that the engineering of the system works, because it's not produced naturally by the organisms that we're working with. This looks like a horrendous diagram, but actually this is the magic. This is CSIC's magic brick. Essentially, this system is built of modules, and each module contains a designed metabolism. Some are natural, some are designed. But in this particular case, you can see, let's think of that module as a little house for bacteria. On the upper floor, we have bacteria or microorganisms that love light. And when they get sunlight, they overproduce sugar. Now, that sugar can then move through a membrane, the blue dotted line in the middle, into the lower chamber that doesn't really need light at all, but it loves sucrose. And when we have a sucrose-rich environment, we can get microbes that don't normally form biofilms together to live together and work together so that we can make new products from engineering their metabolisms. So the top one is called the farm module. That's to make all the sweet sticky stuff. And the labor module is where we then start to build new kinds of molecules. As you can see, the whole system takes in grey water and also polluted air. So as it's performing work, unlike a machine, it's actually cleaning the environment and the liquid waste that's going into it. Diagram of how this might look in a kitchen or a bathroom. In the middle, you can see the different coloured small oblongs. Those are the little stomachs. This is where the wastewater, which is the big blue square at the top, is feeding down into these systems that are causing the metabolic transformations, and then the products and waste are collected at the bottom. So at the moment we've got a gravity feed system. We're trying obviously to reduce the amount of external energy going into the system, so our microbial fuel cells, which are these things, are actually doing their own independent work. They're actually generating electricity that is self-powering them. Now this is the first prototype from the system, which we called a living brick. It is the first time that we've brought together structure and metabolism in a unit of building design, the brick. And it's really made of a natural biofilm, which is similar to compost. And that colonizes a membrane which allows the wastewater to go through the membrane and produce oxygen and fresh water, and we pull electricity off at the same time. And that work's being done at the University of the West of England. Now, how do you actually structure metabolisms that require completely different kinds of environments in order to work? And this was a prototype for an integrated brick, one that would work with phototropic organisms, in other words, light-loving organisms, which is the outside of those bricks. But the black columns you can see were anaerobic environments that didn't need light and were having a completely different metabolic reaction inside, yet the metabolites reinforced each other. This is the way that the final product is coming to life, as it were, and it's due to be completed by April the 1st, so we're not quite there yet, but we're in the process of production. The top layer is the light-loving environment, and we're having to figure out how to design it so that people don't get blinded by the amount of light that we're using. And underneath you can see how we're developing the little stomachs and how these different environments are being fed by the nutrients. And so we really need to think about the infrastructures of our buildings. Rather than having drains, we want our buildings to have recirculated water, recirculated air. They need breathing systems, they need digestive systems, and not just these simple vents and drains that take resource in and throw it out in all kinds of contaminated ways. This is the model. This is not the literal thing. It's a sketch there just to say that we're now starting to take these living bricks and introduce them into cultural and artistic contexts. This is the model for an exhibition that's opening next week at the Whitechapel Gallery called Is This Tomorrow? And essentially it's kind of like a creature in a wall that is generating power for the living space of as an unidentified inhabitant as yet. So it's talking about the possibilities of tomorrow in terms of the way that we inhabit our spaces. But the actual photographs will be out next week sometime. And that is one of the units that's been used within the system. And these units have been used in different ways, so don't think of this as just a one-off or a kind of an oddity. This is a lunar lander model that was designed by EOS, Laufen, and the University of West England. And it has microbial fuel cells that forms a closed-loop recycling system for the lunar lander. So in other words, it's saying that microbes and microbial systems, when well designed, could potentially support life off-world. Other forms of microbes have obviously been used in other systems like this BIQ, the intelligent building, which was co-designed by Arup, and they used little green algae that flourished in sunlight and ate carbon dioxide to produce biomass, which is now being recycled throughout the building and used in different ways. So quite literally, there are more and more prototypes and building experiments that are incorporating the actions of microbes in their functioning. Some of them actually even in the materials they produce. So just switching over to design, just for a few seconds just before I close, but how might this actually start to look in terms of our design? Well, this is a fantastic film, which is The Cook, the Thief, His Wife and Her Lover by Peter Greenaway, and the whole story is set within a building which acts like a kind of digestive system. And I just thought that Greenaway's fantastic stage design started to create an idea of inner spaces that have moods that respond to the actions of its inhabitants and start to literally express the inner life of a building. And so just to close, the raindrops here are really about, how do we actually, in an imaginative way, start to grasp what a metabolism might be? How do we start to conjure forth what a metabolic design looks like? And I think that that's something that's still under construction, and I'm sure that Mike Weinstock is going to give us many more insights into those possibilities. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Reti, for that generous introduction. I'm going to start way back in 1818. This is Carl Caspar Friedrich, and there are various names for this, Wanderer over the mist and so forth, but there's several things I'd like you to notice about this. It's a young person. Cities in those days were thought to be entirely separate from the country and the landscape. Young people went to some significant point in the landscape and they surveyed the landscape in front of them as a metaphor for their journey and future through life. And I'm going to end with it where we are today with the equivalent image to this. But I'd also like you to look at the mist and the trees and the vision of nature there. This sentence, every generation will have to build its own city, comes from 1914, Sant Elia, for those architects in the audience. He was a young Italian futurist. He died not long after in a very stupid battle in the First World War. But he's one of the great kind of insights and poets of, I think, of urbanism, one of the very first. And he talked about calculation and all kinds of things you'd associate with the 1920s, but he meant this also as a project of the imagination, and that building a city was a generational long project of thinking and reimagining the city. So, there are a few points here that I think I've made in previous publications, but particularly to do with our intelligence and intelligence of all species arises out of metabolism. And the principal thing that I want to point out to you in this very beautiful, this is not a single creature. Each one of those little cup-like things reproduces on its own. It kind of splits. And it self-organizes into this system. This is a metabolic system. And it's the first kind of, at the smallest level that I can find, that shows there's a spatial intelligence to metabolism, a spatial organization. We're all quite familiar with this with the forest. If you go to a natural forest, the big trees are in certain places and the medium ones and the small ones, and they all fit together. It's really competitive, we know, but it's spatial too. And the flow of nutrients and of energy and of information between all of them is what we call the ecology. So ecology is as much a spatial organization of metabolic flows as it is of data and species. And this, one of my favorites too, is a very prime example of this. None of these creatures can only live for minutes and sometimes hours by themselves. But en masse, en group, they can exchange fluids and materials between them, and their behavior and their capacity to adapt to their environment is far greater than the sum of just adding them up. So there's something extra, additional is gained. It's one of the principles of complexity, that when you put the aggregate components together to a high level of organization, the behavior and the outputs are of a superior order. And we might find these very, very familiar organization. The second kind of level of material organization comes on metabolism. Again, I'm very grateful for Rachel kind of laying this foundation, is the exporting of some aspects of metabolism. We have exported almost all of ours. No human, if I took this handsome young, fit young man here, dropped him into the jungle, he's not going to survive maybe a day, 2 days, if he's very knowledgeable, 3. Yeah. We don't either have the knowledge, but we have exported almost everything. And this starts at this level. It's a material organization, it has thermal capacities, it can store energy in the form of foods and honeys and so forth, which are extremely dense and will last them for a long time. And there's a level of behavior, of intelligent behavior, that is entirely originates from metabolism. And of course this kind of very famous examples, these things have very complex behavior. Somehow somebody tells the ones on the inside, it's your turn on the outside, but there's nobody in charge. There's no boss that says, I'm the boss here, out you go, you're out in this bit. And they manage to accommodate themselves, and they will stay out there until they're close to their critical capacity, and then they will shuffle back inside and into the warmth. So that's how they can cope with the extreme cold. They're super smart in the way they cope with the extreme heat, because if you've got that much insulation, as you know, if you're wearing too many clothes or if you eat too much, you're going to get really hot, and they can dump their heat through their feet. So their metabolism does that. It's in the same way that our pores open, the blood vessels inside their Fat linings can be rerouted to drop heat, something we can't do. Okay, so all cities evolve. They originate in a particular place. Barcelona is Northern Mediterranean. If we go back into its great history, you can find, and many of you will know much more than I do of it, but you can find the successive layers of architectural and spatial invention that have come to it and are still here. We have a particular problem in urbanism when we think about a city, that we tend to think of a city, or at least authorities do until recently, as just a collection of buildings. And I remember one very famous architect telling me when I was a student, and I said, well, what about the public space? And he said, well, that's just the stuff left over between the buildings. But cities evolved with public spaces and with routes through them, and this is arguably those patterns of behavior, the same as the wasp nest and bee's nest, encode the patterns of connections and spaces, encode the behavior of people who occupy them. So if you take the metabolist view, this is a fairly straightforward thing in biology, and we expect to see the same in cities, and it can be tested and examined. So if we return to the point about every generation, we have amazing tools to do things with now. It's quite stunning in some computational ways what can be achieved. There's going to be an issue with running some of them on this laptop here, and we've tried to run a couple of them, and I've tried to show them. But we can compute great numbers of things these days. We can study parts of cities and treat them as samples, the same way an oncologist or a biologist would treat a tissue sample. We can analyze them, we can produce data, we can understand a great deal about them. If they're ones that are evolved and that we admire, we can also carry with it some of the spatial values. And we have means of analyzing in a more contemporary way numbers of connections. So these are essentially, could be diagrammed out as topological diagrams, but they're to do with connectivity, the sequences of spaces, and the amount of space that's proportionate to the built space. And some of them are still ancient, but still very present. China, very interesting, recently has rediscovered its hutong, having demolished almost all of them. But recently they are starting to do new developments based on ancient street patterns, ancient artisan modes of occupying buildings and the relations of buildings to spaces and how they're connected. And if you remember Rachel's diagram of metabolism, it's not just the unit, it's the connections and the pattern of those connections in the broader picture that is significant. And my point is social and spatial cannot be separated for humans as they cannot be for any other living organism. So these are some further examples of modes of analysis, and what we can do with these is start to breed them. This is the Cerdà block, as many of you will know, the Cerdà superblock. That we can take these samples and these different ways of analyzing them. We can write the equivalent of a genome for them. We can breed them. We can determine who survives, what the success rate of breeding is, and so forth. And we can produce huge numbers of variations. We can take those pre-computed or computed variants of what we know to be good systems, and to a certain level, we can, if we have a patch of a city, we can allow them to sort themselves out as to what will be the best possible connection. We're nowhere near as smart as that sinophore, that tiny thing I showed you, with the beautiful little cup-shaped things. But certainly, even in a very simple way, with these connections, we can they can find the best routes for higher level connections, openings through doorways that open into this, so how a street opens into a secondary square, and so forth. There are cities now where, this is Chicago, this is not an academic, although it grew out of our program, where they're beginning to model the morphology of the city, not just as the shapes of buildings, but their pattern of energy use. Still, in urban terms, we're like the very early metabolists. So metabolism starts, Rachel will correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's somewhere around 1930s, and the first kind of real scientific experiment was to take a young cow and to paint some white stripes on it, and then for many months they measured the total quantity of food that went in one end and the total quantity of stuff that came out the other end. And at the end of the experiment, they weighed the cow, and that was the first metabolism. If you compare that to the sophistication we've seen in those diagrams. But urbanism is pretty much like that. Most countries know how much energy and material flows through their cities in a year. They don't know a whole lot more. They know the behavior of some buildings, and in some cities, those buildings can be regarded as dynamical patterns. There's a numerical representation, and they can watch how those numbers change over the year. They do this mainly for coding reasons, for urban zoning reasons, but there's a great promise in this. And we can co-evolve. This is a start of where different kinds of things we can show the effect of. So that little animation, we're showing how streets can be co-evolved with networks with real-time analysis feeding back how well they're connected and changing the growth. And this is an example of the output where seawater canals and urban morphology can evolve, have been evolved computationally together. And we see more promising things as for San Francisco, where these kinds of techniques are starting to be used to predict behaviors in what will be much more difficult circumstances than we have today. So there's great promise in that. But what have we actually done? Climatically, the great bulk of emissions that humans have ever made have been in the last 25 years. When we knew it was a totally crazy, bad thing to do, humans did their worst. This is not biologically rare. Nearly every species in some way will trash its environment. But we need to have a close look at what we've done. This is Highway 5. Anyone who's flown into Los Angeles, this endless brown carpet, it takes about 20 minutes to fly over it. And Delhi, this is Delhi. There's huge areas of the world that are built like this, with very little differentiation, almost no street life, in extremely poor conditions, and they're producing huge amounts of emissions. We're used to the idea that everything comes from somewhere else in a city. This is not far from here, Almeria, and I had lovely orange juice and tomatoes this morning. I'm sure they came from somewhere like that. I'm not being moral about this, but this is how we've evolved to a point where the city and nature are thought of as totally separate. Nobody questions where these things are produced. And yet once in ancient days, cities contained all their animals and all their food production inside the city. Cities were productive not just of information, as they are now, but of everything else we need for our metabolism. And we forget that a significant fraction of people don't live in the city, but live here. And why is this important? Well, for the younger architects, this is significantly the major work of the next generation. 2 billion people, if the UN is right. Unless everybody's going to stop doing what humans have always done, it's going to be 2 million people, 2 million cities. There's evidence that we can look at for human behavior of what happens when these things go wrong. This is from the 1930s. Ecologists call them the dirty 30s. Over-farming, cities that are overpopulated for their capacity, the soil is exhausted, very, very small climate change, nothing like we're facing. Couple of decades of drought, few degrees, very, very little compared to what we're facing. And some of you will know, underneath the prairies of the US is sand. So this part of the world was once sand dunes, as was this part of the world. And this is what was left. Around about 1927, this is the Depression. These are young architects, no work for them, they're working on the film set of Metropolis. There starts to be a change in the attitude, cultural representations of the attitudes to nature, but the city is still seen in Metropolis as some kind of monstrous machine. The beginning of a change is the eroticization of technology, but also that it's cast now in its most particular form as a person, a female person. Okay. And I'll return to that. These are Spanish refugees from just before the Second World War. Spain not only going through great political transformations at the time, an impending war and German invasions, but also very little written about big ecological transformations too. Much more, I think, to do with kind of social and transformations. And we've invented whole new ways of destroying things that past humans didn't. It's Tokyo firestorms. And what we forget, some basis for contemporary computation starts here. The calculations that were done to how you set a city on fire are some of the basis of algorithmic computation. This is the first that I know of significant biological act of warfare. Agent Orange, 7 million acres. We're into the third generation of birth defects, ineradicable from human societies in these territories. Once the genome has reached that level of been corrupted to that level, it cannot be repaired. And the defects persist down through the generations. I'm not going to show any of those, and it's not always easy unless you belong to medical institutions to gain access to them. What are the actual incidents of them? But this was taken very shortly afterwards. And Chernobyl, another great human technique for destroying cities and the environment. You can take a trip there now. They give you a nice white paper suit. You can go on a tour, little bits, and they'll show you the double stem plants and some of the old classrooms, and they always take you to the little Ferris wheel thing. And what they won't show you are the children and the children of those children. And very recently, from the Middle East, what was once a great city that we see now. And the cost of our lives, my life as well, my computer, my car, my phone, is this. Particularly in computation, it's this 500-year half-life. 500 years it will take for the environment to repair itself if we stop doing these things. And we've developed whole new ways of creating toxins, and we have, in a way, a very good biological response. We give them to the poorest people in remote parts of the world. This is what many organisms would do. Morally, we might take a different view of that, because those people's lives are radically shortened by the disposal of these things. Many of the things we make that make our life better are incredibly difficult to dispose of, and they have and are continuing to alter our world. And the cost of tonight is something like this. This is from Katerina. This is close by. This is for those of you who live in Spain. This is from last year. And, you know, I have many friends here, and they will say, we're used to this, you know, our country has always been dry, but what's not always recognized is that the dry months getting longer. What used to be, when I was a boy, 2 months, 2.5 months is now commonly 3.5 and sometimes 4. And this is accelerating. And when it's very dry, every spring you also have the dust and the sand coming. This is actually Beijing. And if you compare the color of this fog to the one in the painting, this fog is so dangerous. When we were visiting a couple of years ago, no family will take children outside in this weather, and adults wear masks all the time. It's cold and toxic. In 1982, in the cultural view of nature, is the year the first Blade Runner film was released. Very significant cultural change. And it's not because the director or the writers were prescient in any way. They're just like the rest of us. These are guys and girls who went to the same schools, they wore the same clothes, same education, live in the same houses. So these are an expression of societal worries and concerns. This is Sebastian. Sebastian in his laboratory, surrounded by the living creatures he has made. They're his friends, but also each one of them has a particular functionality. They are living things, but some are very good at one thing and some are very good at the other. And if you remember the story of Blade Runner, it's about the creation of replicants. Humans, actually a bit better than humans, but they look very like humans, and they were to do all the dangerous work off planet, because we didn't want them worried about them getting mixed up in normal life. And they kept the lifespan very short. This is an image from what was called a fictional test, Voigt-Kaufmann test in the film, but it was based on a real thing that under stress, certain parts of your eyes will, the pattern of that will dilate, and an indication of untruths. There's ambiguities about replicants in those films, but significant change today. I have just ordered one of these from Amazon. Right? It's become so normalized, the idea of a replicant, so accustomed that we're way even past worrying about whether humans can be redesigned or whether they're artificial or not. People want to be them, young people particularly. These are mass sellers, which I think is an extraordinary thing. This image, quite famous now in the US. This is from David Wallace, who amongst Trump, who's trying desperately to eradicate all climate science and all knowledge of cities and forms and behavior, starts to be this kind of very brave talk, finally, about what if the worst predictions are true? What if it's true, because mathematically they're all possible, and they're not even very unlikely anymore? What do we have if these things turn out to be true? 4.5 degrees, which 10 years ago in my work I selected as what I thought was a reasonable top range, is now considered mid-range and scientifically respectable to say this is not only possible, it's likely. Scientists have these kind of codes of saying something is they never say anything is certain, because you can't be a good scientist and say it's certain, but you can say it's very likely, it's possible, it's not very likely, and so forth. And this is well worth a read, and he's just published a book which I think is coming out in a few weeks' time. But I think the image is very, very significant. There's a large part of climate science that is not considered, that governments don't want to make. They don't want to scare people. They don't really want to talk about it. So we tend to talk only about the bottom end. This was once one of the best connected cities on Earth. It was on the Silk Road. Probably nowadays you wouldn't call it a city. Its population was 10 to 15,000, and lots of people flowed through it. It was very rich, and they cut down all the trees around them for fuel, and overgrazed the land with animals and plants, and small climate change, the river started to dry up. So we know very well from human history what happens when, as Rachel pointed out, our systems, the ones we developed, and the carrying capacity of the environment become mismatched. So, 150 years' time, the sand that you experience in Barcelona every year, in about 150 years will overrun this city. You already get it every spring from North Africa. I've made these last few images to talk about the worst possible scenario. And when I mentioned to our most respected scientist, he said, 150 years, it could be sooner than that. No government is ever going to tell you this. The way you have to live in those will be similar to the way people have to live in parts of Beijing in the winter. You will always have to wear a mask. You cannot keep the dust and the sand out. Those of you who live, as I do, near a beach when the wind is blowing, our house fills up with it every day. You can't keep it out. And if it's very fine, as the particles are that you get from North Africa, you can't keep it out of the air, and your children will have to wear masks all the time. And finally, I want you to think about, to place this in relation to the first image I showed you. 200 years separate. We made this image, but Descartes is the 2049 Blade Runner. Nobody knows if he's a replicant or not, and in the end it turns out in the film it actually doesn't really matter, because replicants and humans have interbred and there's no significant distinction. Nature is, in this case, biologically doing something that nature has always done. Animals evolved and adapt to their environments. Humans have always adapted their environment. And in my view, this is one of the potential outcomes. Thank you. That's an optimistic one, isn't it?
Thank you both. I think it makes sense that all views are put on the table because they are the risks, but also the possibilities. No? I would like to ask something in relation to the fact that you're both talking about special intelligence. No, you have all both used the word intelligence and how this can be. How this can affect space. And I feel that what you are talking about and what we are working on in the living organism idea is something that goes beyond intelligence. What intelligence is thought today, especially with the word smart cities, smart buildings, it is related in a certain automation. Yes, buildings are automatically, let's say, respond to a specific stimuli. Cities are operating based on data in an automated way, but all of this idea of smart is related with control. It's basically about control. Now, when we are talking about the living, or when we are talking about a special intelligence, where microbial organisms, that they are alive, they are creating a brick, or where we're talking about master plans or urban environments that need to adapt in terms of mass or density to certain environmental or human conditions, then we're talking about an evolution, as both of you said, that is actually not about control from humans, no? And I'm wondering, whereas we are ready to lose control, or until which degree we are ready to lose control in this scenario?
Well, I would say we were never in control. I mean, we live on a highly dynamic, constantly changing planet. And I think that this idea of hard control is something that we've taught ourselves, particularly again through the Enlightenment, bringing controls into kind of understanding the world, to simplify, to reduce, to clarify, to demystify. I think that's all good. But when it comes to the idea of intelligence, the Enlightenment intelligence is disembodied, and it gets, separated with the soul and reason. This doesn't have a connection to matter, not theoretically. It gets transposed into mathematics. Mathematics becomes intelligence itself because it's not contaminated by the senses. So the Enlightenment intelligence is a disembodied thing. But I think that we're looking at an age with agentized materials where there is an embodied intelligence, that intelligence is soft, it's a form of soft agency. It's the weak things that we started off with, which we're neglecting to acknowledge in the way that we design and engineer the world. And I think that there is a kind of recalcitrant power that we have factored out of oversimplification, and we're starting to come up against that as we enter into this age where the world seems to be biting us back, as it were. And I think that that kind of slippage between that top-down form of hard control and the soft power, embodied intelligence of a dynamic material realm. It's not all materials, it's ones that are away from equilibrium, that we're having to negotiate now very consciously, and that's not been our training for the last 500 years.
But do you think then, Michael, that this soft intelligence or bottom-up process of designing, then it's not about form at all? No, we are not designing forms. We are either designing performance or behavior.
So, you can. What I would say in response to that, and also to what Rachel was saying, the hardest thing to crack computationally for people modeling cities is the relationship between form and its metabolism. So we nearly all of architectural history and architectural training, we're trained to make forms, to shapes, to fill them with programs and what goes in them, and the whole kind of way the history of architecture is written is like that. Our model of intelligence, I think, is wrong. So in the model of general intelligence seems to me, at least in architecture, really, really badly wrong. I think intelligence is domain-specific. So I would say, the electrical grid in some countries is really intelligent, because all it has to do, it's all is difficult, it took a long time to do it, is route its flows according to demand. But that's intelligent. That's the Turing test. If it looks like it's behaving intelligently, it's not really meaningful to ask, is it really intelligent? It doesn't need to tell you anything about Shakespeare or Don Quixote or anything like that. It's very domain-specific. We don't really have enough knowledge or understanding of the ecology or ecosystems of cities to see how all our little systems really relate together. So without knowing that, we can't make a model of intelligence. Abandoning it, the soft control, I would also... I think that was abandoned a long time ago, because it used to be that if you look back in ancient histories, you'd say, well, intelligence resided with the people. It's the Romans who invented the first plans of cities. Not true, but that's how it's written in European architectural history books. First learned how to codify through taxing different modes of occupation in the cities. So all the intelligence arises out of human culture, which encodes ways of being in cities. But I think the big schism comes simply through numbers, that these were not scalable. It's not possible for any single human to understand everything about a city. I don't think it is. I don't think it's even possible for a really enlightened city government to actually know what everybody's doing and what the flows are, and so that's why they're reduced to measuring like their cow. They just measure how much energy and how many bricks come in and how much oil and this and that, but we don't weigh the city. We don't metabolism is calculated for living things when they move, when they're at rest, when they're growing, when they're dying. All of those things are modeled, but this is not true of cities or buildings.
And I think that we get kind of fixated on form as being final. And if you go back to De Lorenzo's relationship between DNA and metabolism, it's a constant negotiation. He doesn't, so the politics and the economy, he doesn't say that DNA is not important. He doesn't say that top-down control isn't relevant. He says that, there's this dance between, kind of expanding a field of possibility by investing in it, and then being able to do things because you've made that investment, and then that metabolism comes back and goes, you can't do that because, you haven't done this first. So I think that, we tend to deal with final form as a final solution to something that, if we've made a final form, we're expecting it never to change. And it, as Mike has shown in his presentation, it's changing all the time.
The fact of this change or this adaptation is also related with ideas of ephemerality, no? Like for many years we have been building rigid, we have been building static, we have been building things so that they can stay there for longer than we. And then you very much, very nicely quoted Santelia about how the fact that each generation should build their own cities, which means that we need to have a thinking of a more circular way of how we build. Still, the revolution in materials related with construction, such as the steel revolution or the concrete revolution, is the exact opposite of what a circular materiality could be. And I wonder, whereas we need to rethink that materiality, you are rethinking the materiality when you're creating a mix of biological organism and artifice, but what's
but can
the appropriate materiality?
Can it all be about making new materials? I don't know, because biology does amazing things with, little bags of water. Biochemists will tell you, a cell is just this little membrane with some squishy stuff in it. And yet these amazing structures come. There's nowhere to go now. There's no room left in the world. If we were going to start again, if we were a species, in the 18th century we'd say, we'll leave all this here and we'll go over there and we'll make a new city and we'll find some new ideas and new ways of thinking. We'll make it over there. The real problem is, how do you remake this city or any other city whilst you're still living in it? Because I think that is, I'm just hoping there are younger people who are going to be able to do this, and we can provide some clues, but I think this is a generational task. It's not a quick, easy solution. At least human history shows us it's not been.
I think for me, there is a possibility to increase the complexity of design materials, but it requires an appropriate increase in the complexity of our infrastructures. You can't have dynamic, the dynamics of a material system are very constrained when it's flapping around in air. I mean, there's a reason for things being in water that are associated with life and a kind of successive deposition. So the way that we build our buildings is really designed to house machines. We build the shape first, and then we put the plumbing in and the electrics and kind of wire it all up. And most of the things that we're supporting in there are actually mechanical devices. If we actually wanted breathing systems, if we wanted kind of complex depositions, let's think of the way that the stromatolites are built in Shark Bay with soft layers, then infiltration by water, deposition of minerals, and increase these layers and layers, then we need to think about how resources are brought into our buildings and how they're used and how they are reused, because we just throw them away. And it's keeping the matter in a space where it can be dynamic that will greatly enhance the complexity of materiality.
I sort of agree in that, but my worry is, humans aren't smart enough to change their behavior, and that's no matter how good you make with this building or that one. If the world continues as it is, and statistically there's very good reason to think it won't change. I'm not taking a moral position, but it just simply wouldn't be enough to change the materials. If we were really smart biologically, we would adapt ourselves. We'd learn how to live with dust, dryness, to conserve water. We do it all in our bodies, but we can't.
Yeah.
So, or maybe we can. Yeah. Maybe there's scientists here who say we can, but until we're able to do that, we have to change our cities. Maybe it's smarter to live in smaller cities.
Yeah.
But there are cities that almost are without end now.
Yeah.
Washington, you can, on the eastern coast of the US, it's pretty much an urban tissue from Manhattan, almost all the way down to, you're almost in Florida before you start getting breaks in that corridor. Yeah. India has the same condition.
I would agree that material complexity is not enough. I mean, it's not a solution. But if we wanted to increase some of the characteristics of our buildings, I think we need to rethink our infrastructures, which again kind of goes into those notions of, what is it that we're actually valuing? What are we culturally exchanging? What has worth in these situations?
We usually connect this work of finding adaptive solutions with sustainability. No, we are very much looking to find solutions that they can be much more resourceful or less, let's say, impacting the environment. And I wonder that in the digital era today, there are cultural changes with the way that people behave and the way that people live. No, the way that we are navigating in our urban environments with our smartphone, it's radically different than we were with the automobile, or the way that we're sharing services rather than owning products, or even the fact that we are reconfiguring our idea of property, or what is a house, And I wonder where are the needs of the people, or whereas how the architecture, that dynamic architecture, can respond to the changing needs of the people.
Well, I guess I would start with this, we've adopted the word sustainability almost as a word that hopes things can stay the same. And I think they can't. I think that we need a radical break in the way that we think and we make cities. It's not going to be easy. We will find that there are hybrids. So I would say that, there are certain parts of the world that are just going to fail to be able to adapt to the changes that are happening. So, for example, New Orleans is one city that's already kind of seeing the first climate migrants and a strategy to hold back the sea that is just simply not happening soon or fast enough. So I think, I'm not going to share all of Mike's gloom. But I think that we have serious problems, and we're not going to solve them all. But I think that we do have to look for those kind of radical breaks in practice expectations. The infrastructures, I think, are really important, and that care, our reinvestment in the earth that we're drawing from in order to grab all these resources. If you think what we do when we build a modern city, we smother the soils with concrete and tar, and those are the richest soils on the planet. And then we complain that we're losing 3% of our kind of fertile soils. That we really have to take a good look at where we are and think about locally. I think the solutions are local.
Yeah,
that there's a different solution in Barcelona than there is in Newcastle, where I come from.
And I think that's a really important thing. I'm quite a cheerful person, I'm not, but this late in life, I think it's come to me that it's really important to look hard and cold at this, and not to be thinking it'll be all right. Because without many changes, I think some of the ones you pointed out are really important, but without many changes, humans are not sustainable. I even hate the word. It seems to me there's a frame of mind that allows the politicians to say, as they did, we'll aim at 2 degrees, we'll fix it at 2 degrees, which is such really bad science, because these are processes. You can't say, I'll stop it there. It's a process, and once it's running, you can try and reshape the process or influence it or add things or take things away from the process. What you can't do is say it ends there. And it allows people to frame the problem in a way to push it, as all politicians do, to push it, as the English say, to kick the can down the road. Because I'll be gone. I'll be dead and buried when you're facing this problem. When you're middle-aged with children and, and your children are asking questions or they're growing up and they're having children. I'm gone. And too much, I think, of the world climate science has been treated like this. There is really good science. There's really good science of buildings. There's a lot of cultural knowledge of how people in the past have behaved and adapted to these things. I think, it has to be someone to say, look it in the face. You can't go on like this. And, so
how can we
allow
allow people to participate within this complex process of computation, design, planning, growing?
It starts with the imagination, surely. It's, nobody cracks a big problem all by themselves. It's a collective act and a cultural one. Nobody can compute it all individually, but you have to make something that's convincing enough to get other people to join with you in certain activities. And I think you're right. It's not completely true to say everything works bottom up, or if we solve it locally, but it is true enough to say this is a reasonable way to go forwards and to start. It is real enough and can be measured. Yes, I would like to think the Manhattan Project, I don't know if you know, some of the blacker histories of computation. Manhattan Project was how to make the atomic bomb small enough that it was transportable so they could go and drop it on people. Mm-hmm. And it was solved in less than 18 months because huge amounts of intellectual effort from an enormous number of people. It wasn't so much money, but huge resources were given to it. And I feel the resources aren't given to these problems in the right way. Some of the problems are, in the world she's occupying, are below the level of the eye. And some of the problems are, you can't walk across them in one day. And there are relations between them, and there are people who can model, as our distinguished colleagues here, can mathematically model some of these relations. But still the project of how you imagine that as a future is not done. And all of the pieces are there, but collectively it's not done.
And with that I say that we need to tell each other different kinds of stories. And I think that is happening culturally, so people like Donna Haraway, Bruno Latour, some of the new materialists, Timothy Morton, just opening up new spaces of possibility, trying to revalue things and, let's say, not deproblematizing the situation that we've got, but actually trying to find new allegiances, kind of going back to that idea of it isn't just about the small, weak things, but that's a start to shoring up foundations. We also need to have a vision of where we could be, and try and figure out what some of those steps are. So I think we get stuck in, well, it's possible or it's not possible. And this idea, I think you mentioned it earlier, Mike, that you get accused of being science fiction if you start to, let's say, experiment with variables.
There's nothing wrong with science fiction. Some of the smartest people on earth, some of the great physicists of the last 100 years and mathematicians have written science fiction.
Yeah, but it's that space of what we don't know. Yeah, we don't know what this could be, but if this works with this, then maybe there's some ways forwards there. And I think we need a greater engagement with that idea of experiment.
Well, maybe that's a good point. The science fiction one. What we're not seeing are urbanists who make models of cities doing what some physicists who have written the great science fiction films or novels. Why is Metropolis, the film in 1927, why are people still watching it? I have too many children, 5 children, but the young ones are still renting it for, and buying it. Why is that? Some of these visions are really powerful, and what we're not seeing is, the same level of invention of people putting forward a new city. It was in the 1930s, almost every architecture book you opened, the title was The New City. It was, so many people tried to design a new city. Almost no one does now. I haven't yet, but maybe you will.
Cities are the ones that generating a lot of problems today, but they are also the solution. No? Cities are fostering growth and innovation and creativity, so it is the place where solution can take place at the end of the day. Now we have 10 minutes left, and I would like to also open up to questions from you all, or share your thinking or any specific question to Rachel or Michael. Anybody can raise their hand. And I don't know if we have some microphones that can go. Yeah, thank you.
Huh?
Okay. No questions.
I have to put something up.
Oh, thank you.
Well, I'm kind of an intruder here because actually I'm a journalist doing a PhD on a field called theory of communication. So I have a question because indirectly I've been researching something of the spatial organization of society according to human nature. And there's this book called The Architecture of Community by Leon Creers. It's he lives in England, I suppose. And he talks about an urban development that would recognize and foster human nature. And nowadays we know more about human origins and human nature than ever before. So although it's quite unlikely that we will find a solution for the 30 billion people that will be moving to a city during the next 30 years, what's your opinion about taking into account human nature at the moment you're designing a city or reconstructing it?
So, could I ask where?
It came from here.
Over here.
Yeah.
Okay, hi, I can answer in English, right?
English.
Yes? Okay. I have to wear this?
No, you don't.
Okay. Okay. Kriya is a historical morphologist, if I can call it that. He argued when he was younger there were certain shapes of buildings and arrangements of buildings that were essentially right for what he called a good society. So he wasn't the only one. If you're doing your studies, you've come across Christopher Alexander, who's probably the major proponent of that kind of argument. That when you say human nature, it's not a phrase that I would use. If you mean the way humans behave, I don't think it's innate. Certain level of it is. Certain parts of it are modifiable. Sorry, can you say again?
Sorry. I don't want to hijack the question, but I'm talking about the structure of human sociability, which is something that has been studied through evolutionary anthropology. And for example, people need the meaningful world is the world of the people you know, and not the people that you don't know, like in a city with 10 million people. That's what I was referring to, sir.
So, people want to be in cities. People want to live together. They always have. There are no solitary humans, and if there were, there would be no need for speech, for writing, for any kind of cultural activity. There would be no need even for intelligence, because that's all to do with relations with other people. So if we start from that premise, some of Kriya's arguments are really good, I think. That there are, as I would take the same view, that there's more to a city or more to a town than just the collection of buildings. It's the patterns and the flow of usages between them. And that's right. Some countries that's expressed as a social argument. Most famously, one of my great heroes said, a town or a city is an object of nature and a subject of culture. At one and the same time, a thing that is lived and a thing that is dreamed. Levi Strauss, great anthropologist. Humans have always had this thing about cities or towns that are, on the one hand, intensely practical, We want the shit to go away. We want to store our food and have spaces to talk to people and meet other people and places for privacy. But it's always been also a cultural act, a dream. And I'm always on the science side. I love my whole life loved things that I've always wanted to be a nerd and measure things. It's just, everybody's different. But almost all of, you can look at human culture, the great writings, are about ways of being, how to behave in relation to other people. Can architecture do that? Some of us, Korea would say yes. That actually if you design the little city or the town right, everyone will live a nice life and they'll all behave well. And others would say, serial killers come from the suburbs. Yeah. You make it too nice, you're going to breed something extra nasty in humans. I don't know. I don't know that anybody can answer that. You can track different positions and different histories. Ultimately, we're awaiting new ones, and I've known and respect Leon Korea, but ultimately my argument will be nothing from the past. We should study it and know it, but we need new things because our future is new. We are having to face a world that is so different that we will need new things, and I'm not convinced myself, even although a lot of my life has been studying Arabic cities, which I love. I'm not convinced myself that anything from the past is going to help greatly. Apart from the one thing you mentioned, we should hold on to, that this is collective. It's what we do with other people. And I think that's, I don't know if that's a kind of doctoral answer, right? Kind of weaving around it. Yeah. I think this is a big problem for you to answer. And if you do, I'd love to read it.
More questions? Yep, we got.
Yeah, I have a comment and a question. I like that you Michael, brought the dust bowl, the big dust storms from the 20s and 30s, because I think one interesting lesson that we should learn about that, and we might face that in the future, is that, that when there was a debate in the States about what to do about that, and the Republicans, of course, were kind of saying, well, this is, poor people, let's let them die, and that's all. And the thing that was when this was debated in Washington, a dust storm came to Washington, and that made people think, well, maybe you have to do altogether something about it. That's one worry about when decisions are going to come out. And my question is related to the potential scenarios for intervention where cities play a leading role. I remember that Rachel published a paper in Nature a while ago about Venice, and whether we could think in terms of engineering reefs embedded with engineered bacteria to try to address problems that had the laguna. And in general, I think that cities are an opportunity, and we have to face the future having cities in mind, because more and more people is living there. It's more than 50% now. Maybe the scale of changing buildings or something like that is a long scale to face it. But I was wondering if what do you have to suggest about a potential roadmap of where to intervene if we do that? Cities produce sewage and a lot of residues which nobody likes, so we could intervene in that. But maybe the area of influence of the city is the real target. And what is there, and what are the plans?
Oh, great! That's a great question. Actually, I'm someone who probably unsurprisingly would start with a home. I think the home has an economics, and the economics of the oikos, and a sphere of power that enables individuals to act. The challenge with cities is to get everybody to follow the same program. So for me, I'm very interested in the role of the home in catalyzing change. It also enables a great deal of heterogeneity. The downside is, the surveillance. How do we know we're all kind of pulling towards a good outcome? So that idea of a balance between the activities in a home, and then interconnecting different homes with shared values to create networks of exchange. Let's call them metabolisms, whether those are kind of cultural social values, whether those are the way that materials are disposed of or recycled, and resource production. But I think that the power needs to go. I take Mike's point about not everything comes from the bottom up, but I take Umair Huq's point that we have underinvested and undervalued the activities that take place in very local environments. They're not the solution to everything, but I think there needs to be a serious reinvestment in that. So the roadmap would be homes to communities to conurbations to cities then, but allowing that heterogeneity and the difficult negotiations that exist between people, their neighbours, cultures, to actually be diplomatically negotiated as a kind of politics. And I think that the politics has to change. We think we're looking at instead of an industrial capitalistic model, we have to look at an ecological metabolic model, let's call it, where there are more horizontal connections between bodies. Nothing is ever exactly on the same level, but that kind of gap between the haves and have-nots needs to radically be reduced. And so I think that these are multiple challenges all happening at once. But there is a change in the imagination, change in thinking, change in empowerment, re-empowerment, and potentially these ideas about degrowth. That somehow or other we figure out, how we don't just simply consume. Maybe it's not just about reducing consumption, but about increasing what we return. I think these are unfinished conversations, but I think that there are possibilities, and that the more, for me, experimental communities and prototypes and explorations there are, the more information we get about incredibly complex issues.
Yeah, I'm having a kind of online battle with a very famous architect who is saying that all the centre of the city should be given over to developers, and there should be no social housing, and the standards of space that are for the centres of the city should get smaller and smaller. You know who that is. And I've been saying, well, yes, why don't you just breed a whole lot of very, very small people? But that's the biological response. Many species, when they're under stress, they reduce their metabolic load in various ways. Many species do this. Some morphologically by getting smaller, which kind of suggests it might be, and I haven't done the modeling, and I'm sure you could do it quicker and better than me, it might be better metabolically to live in closely connected smaller towns with fewer megacities. As far as I know, nobody's ever modeled or investigated that. Other ways of reducing the metabolic load in biology are by, as I tried to show, being more collective, sharing it. Are there ways, and I think Rachel's work and people like her are beginning to explore that, and in my own, not my own work, but my doctoral students, exploring ideas about how we return to the idea that the city is productive. How do you invent a town or reinvent towns where things are grown, where food is produced, where effluents and wastes, including industrial wastes, are somehow turned into a source material for something else. So I think there are multiple strategies we can take from the biological world.
Okay, I think that with this, with not trying to shrink, but rather trying to be more productive, we can close that discussion. Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you, everybody. Please help me thank and applause once again our guests. And
thank you very much. Thanks for this highly interesting conversation. Gràcies a tothom per ser-hi. La Bienal segueix demà. Aquí hi ha molts altres...
We'll be tomorrow here. Please get your schedule because there are plenty of activities. Tomorrow we'll have the night of the scientific academies. You'll be able to visit institutions such as the Royal Academy of Medicines and also lots of meetings here in the Pedrera. So don't forget about that. Thank you. See you tomorrow.